is wisdom. And what is wisdom? Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, M-E-A-D, once made the observation there are two very different patterns of knowing. And maybe she's unfair in terms of one is called the digital knowing, or mathematical, digital knowing. The other one she called anthropological. The digital knowing, the mathematical knowing, is a linear progression. You move from A, B, C, D. If you jump from A to C, you often ask what happened to B. So it's very clear. The progression is very clear. It's deductive logic. And the kind of reasoning is very familiar to us all. We want to see the causal relationships. We want to move from one step to the other. Anthropological knowing is vague, messy, multidimensional. Often it's also personal. For example, for an anthropologist to visit a city or a tribe or any community, and the anthropologist will have to learn the language, learn the custom, try to make observation, and try to see things. And eventually, a vague pattern emerged. What is that society? First, you arrive in Cambridge. You know where you are. But only after a while, you have some image of what Cambridge is. But that image is vague, messy, multidimensional, some personal, subjectivistic. And you can never be sure what that really is. Now, we often privilege the digital thinking because it's clear, it's consequential, but often we cannot say much about this kind of anthropological knowing in terms of pattern recognition. Well, this style of moral reasoning, let's say the Confucian style of moral reasoning, is more anthropological in that sense, putting more emphasis on pattern recognition than linear progression. So if we want to find a clear reasoning, a clear notion from the premises, and then gradually we'll be able to move on to have a general sense of what that style of moral reasoning is, you must be very disappointed. Because you see many different possibilities, you see multidimensional nature of the style, it's vague, it's messy, and certainly the quest for clarity is at this juncture out of the question. I want to remind you, it's better to think about the anthropological pattern recognition as a way of dealing with a text or dealing with this particular style of Confucian moral reasoning. And it is useful to recognize this particular form of knowing is much more pervasive, much more common. We actually encounter it every day without necessarily conscientiously aware of the meaning of it. It's very significant. It is important for us to know it to understand what is wisdom. But it is not subjective. It is not simply subjective because it has to be, I would call it, intersubjectively confirmed. It's not totally objective, but it has to be intersubjectively confirmed. For example, you want to know something about Cambridge, your experience of your friends and others, you cannot say, I know what that is. You know the map, perhaps, but you don't know how the city life really is. And you need to discuss, debate, and argue with other people gradually to form some sense of what it is. So this is always a veil of ignorance. The veil sometimes is very thick. If you are looking for certainty or clarity of thought, you'll be disappointed. But there is, sometimes we call it fruitful ambiguity. Ambiguity is not very good because if you're confused. Fruitful ambiguity is not bad because your willingness not to tie up loose ends prematurely. It's important not to tie up loose ends prematurely for your own life, for your understanding of a text, for your confrontation with a very sophisticated style of moral reasoning. So there's always a certain sense of suspension. You're always somehow unsure. And that suspension, if you take the fruitful ambiguity seriously, it will help you to move beyond a very superficial, clear understanding to a higher level of comprehension. And the level has to be elevated from time to time. You'll be challenged. For example, you know the pattern first, and after a while, the pattern is changed. You give more subtlety. You have more nuanced understanding of what that is. So sometimes the nuanced understanding in between is much more important than simply the either-or choice. Try to imagine that someone who eventually becomes a friend. You first recognize the face. That recognition, we call pattern recognition, already in artificial intelligence, it's quite an achievement. Because you're recognizing a face, our ability, the human ability to forget or to ignore a large body of literature or large body of data, focusing on the special features. If the computer is not well trained, the computer will not be able to do it because you don't have the memory to get all the details in the kind of precise fashion. So if you know to recognize the face, it is only a very superficial encounter with a person. You can single out, yes, I know Mr. Zhang. I can recognize it. But you know nothing about the person. Then let's say we manage to collect all kinds of data concerning this person. But I have never encountered the person. I never talked to him or her once. No matter how comprehensive my knowledge about the person is in terms of objective data. You get all the CIA, FBI, and secret reports. You have a complete profile of the person, but I've never talked to the person. There's no way you say, I know him or know her. So it requires a face-to-face communication. So we can talk about Mencius. If we want to know Mencius, we want to know something about Mencius, we have to be able to learn how to talk about, not just to talk about, but how to learn from, as if I've already encountered a person, a human being in that situation. There must be certain kind of interchange. If a person refuses to be known or refuses to enter into a conversation with you, there's no way you'll ever become a friend of that person. So there is receptivity on both parts, mutuality. It's not just familiarity. You know, familiarity breeds contempt. Now we realize some people stay together like family members for decades and eventually come up with very superficial understanding of a writer, of a philosopher, of a thinker. Simply being familiar with a person, even as children, may not gain the access to understand how the inner working of the mind, how the feelings, how the concerns. So a Chinese expression of a true friend is knowing myself, 知己, the person who knows myself, sometimes knows myself better than I am, that I know myself. That notion is someone after my heart, requires not only pattern recognition, recognizing the face, but face-to-face communication, dialogue, interchange, and continuous mutually beneficial interaction. And there's a very interesting anecdote in ancient China, actually earlier than the time of Mencius perhaps. There's a great lute player, and he has a great friend who is a great listener. So when this player played the lute and his friend sitting there, if the player's mind was with the lofty mountains, the listener will make comments most appropriate to that particular ethos or style. If the player's mind was deep oceans, he will also reflect very appropriately. So later, also in Chinese literature, the idea of the person who knows my voice, the person who is a listener to my inner voice, become synonymous to the idea of good friend. A true friend is a good listener who can understand my inner voices. Of course, there's a sad conclusion to that story. When the great listener died and the lute player broke his lute and never played again, because if he could play with one person who's a real receptive listener, then that playing for him is not only personally satisfying, it is a sacred moment of communion. And once that is gone, there's no way you can recover that. So the dynamic interchange with what we call an object, with someone out there, becomes absolutely critical for understanding this type of knowing. And in fact, even in strictly scientific inquiry now, not simply in the humanities, all the fields in the humanities, in philosophy, literature, history, religion, cultural anthropology, the interplay between an inside participant and outside observer is critical. We have to be an inside participant in reading the text. Sometimes we assume the voice of the author, but we remain critically reflecting upon that. This interplay between the two. That's true with religion. You want to study the religion of other people, you try sympathetically to understand why this religion becomes meaningful. It is true with history. It's also true with philosophy. But now even in hard sciences, in natural sciences, I had the privilege of visiting Dalai Lama in 1997 with a group of 5 eminent scientists, including a scholar in relativity, scholar in quantum mechanics, and scholar in astronomy. We spent a whole week and we discussed various kinds of issues for 5 hours a day for 5 days. And originally my impression was these great scientists would inform the Dalai Lama about the new advances in sciences. So the Dalai Lama would listen and maybe may learn something from these scientists. But in fact, it was a genuine communication. The scientists were very much interested in the role of a knower as a scientist. Now, the scholar in relativity argues that as an experimenter, not just a knower, as an experimenter, but as someone who is involved in the study of highly complicated natural phenomena, of course deriving theories from that, it is important to recognize, of course now we all recognize the so-called principle of uncertainty, but it is also to recognize a scientist is not simply an observer outside of the natural phenomena. Your design, your way of understanding what's going on actually makes you somehow of a participant in the construction of the scientific inquiry. So there's an interplay between the scientist as an outside observer and also the participant in the process of understanding. It becomes a very interesting, in a way it's kind of mystic, but I think it's interesting, is to say that unless the phenomena you want to invest will be able to unfold, in other words, there's a dialogical relationship with what you study. It is not just something out there, you try to depict it, you try to do experiment on it, and that, what is out there, doesn't move, doesn't do anything, it's over there, and our subjective mind try to comprehend. It's much more complicated, the relationship now. And if that's the case, self-knowledge is absolutely critical for this form of knowing, the pattern recognition. If your mind is not pure, if you haven't disciplined your mind that you become truly disinterested, there's a difference between uninterested and disinterested. Uninterested, you're not interested. You're too much interested, you're not disinterested. You can be intensely interested in the subject and yet you remain disinterested. In the sense, you're not forcing your own subjective biases or ideas on the thing. And that internal discipline is a form of spiritual exercise. And that informal discipline, now we know, this is a new model of knowledge. It's very different from the earlier model. The earlier model is an enlightenment model. Knowledge is like light. The light source is so powerful that ignorance and darkness will be overcome by light source. But now I think that image is no longer appropriate. The image is, how do we know what we do not know? And how do we proceed in such a way that our periphery vision is such that we recognize the more we know, the more we do not know, because the human condition is there's always a gap between what our cognitive mind, no matter how great that is, individually, collectively, can know, and our affective, our needs to know more. The gap can never be bridged to say, well, I've reached it, so I don't need to know anything more. It's not only arrogance, it is really ignorant of the worst kind. So the sense of knowing more is also to recognize that the horizon of unknown becomes further extended. So normally like in the Leibnizian, Leibniz's earlier notion about the world is made of monads. If we penetrate deeply into the basic building blocks of the universe and to look at its monads, to study these monads, eventually we'll have a comprehension. We can build the world from the smallest, and we have a comprehension of how the world is put together. But now we know the more we get to the smaller, the smaller is not more simplified, more non-problematical. It becomes as complicated and as multidimensional, as vague, as messy, as many of the big things that we do. So we have to continue to explore with the understanding that no matter how hard we try, there's always a horizon beyond what the human mind at this particular juncture can do, even if with a long future vision, the possibility of totally overcome the so-called ignorance, then we be omniscient or like God is totally out of the question. So the more we know, the more humble we should become. In the Analects, to say you know what you do not know is a sign of wisdom. To know the horizon, this is complicated, to know the horizon beyond me, not that I deliberately try not to know, but I'm aware of my limitation. Of course, this is all connected with the mentioned notion about destiny, but it's not fatalism. Make a clear distinction between fatalism and destiny. Destiny meaning those kind of conditions, those kind of areas beyond my human comprehension. And yet, the focus is on that which I can control. I can have absolute control over the situation. So the learning of the heart and mind is not subjective learning. It's not simply to learn the interiority of myself at the expense of the external world. It is learning in the most comprehensive sense of encompassing the world, encompassing the body, encompassing the world. So there's no privilege in this sense. You do not study your mind, learning your mind, independent of your body. The body-mind dichotomy is totally rejected. If we use Fingeret's notion, it's not even a rejected possibility. In other words, they never imagine that the body and mind are two different domains, the mental and physical, because they are integrated. Therefore, the images they use in trying to understand the relationship, the images are never exclusive dichotomies, not the body and mind, the spirit and matter as we're familiar with it here, but the root and branch, depth, surface, part, whole, beginning and end. So we should get to the root. All these sensations of us manifest something deeper. We need to get to the root. Superficial manifestation of who we are, our feelings, our responses to the external situations. There's something deeper. We should move from the superficial to the deeper. And we may react very strongly to something at a particular moment. But is that integrated with a much larger idea of ourselves? What is the relationship between the part and the whole? Is there a sequence? It is in this sense then the learning, the search for the lost heart and mind, the learning of the heart and mind is also bodily learning. That's the reason why the integration of the small body and the great body. The reason we call the small body, 99% of the biological, physiological, and other features that we share with other animals of the kingdom is considered small. It's because if we focus on that, the uniqueness of being human will never be fully understood. And that infinitesimal, the very, very small 0.001 difference between us and the rest of the animal kingdoms. That one, if we develop it, if we expand it, if we continue to cultivate it, it will encompass the small body, the 99%, and put them in proper perspective. In other words, it's a question of priority. It's not a question of choice of either or. It's a question of both and, but the priority is absolutely critical. If that priority is not fully understood, then we may feel that we're doing a good job in managing our feelings, managing our ideas. In fact, we're overwhelmed by forces totally beyond our control. And there's what may be called identity diffusion. In a very critical statement in Mencius, is our body and complexion are given to us by heaven. So don't undermine all our feelings. Sometimes we call very selfish feelings. Don't undermine them. Only the sage in this sense means the most fully realized, most completely fully realized human being. Each one of us, inherent in our nature, is the potentiality of becoming a sage. That's assumed, right? Only a sage can give his body complete fulfillment. The body completely fulfilled, which implies the body is the proper home for the heart or for the soul, for the mind. So in this case, for a man to give full realization to his heart is for him to understand his own nature. And a man who knows his own nature will know heaven. By retaining his heart and nurturing his nature, he's serving heaven. Whether he's going to die young or live to a ripe old age makes no difference to his steadfastness of purpose. It is through awaiting whatever is to befall him with a perfected character that he stands firm on his proper destiny. The first quote. To move from the heart, from managing, from understanding the basic feelings of our heart, to an appreciation of nature. Nature here is what makes us so unique. And to understand our nature is a way of understanding heaven, because our nature is confirmed by heaven. And in this sense, if we can retain our heart, the idea is learning consists none other than the search for the lost heart. If chickens and dogs are gone, we know to fetch them. But when our heart is gone, sometimes we do not know it. Some people say mindfulness. Some Buddhist scholars will say mindfulness, but I think the Confucian sense is more than just mindfulness. To be in touch with our feelings, with where we are in an existential situation. But to retain the heart and the nurturing our nature is not simply to do things for ourselves. It is socially significant, but also it is a way to serve heaven. So there's something flows beyond simply social utility, social harmony, or social significance. So whether we die young or live to a primal age, meaning the allotment, the things that we have, the allotment in terms of lifespan, sometimes is beyond our control. But it doesn't mean that we don't cultivate it. The steadfastness of purpose will not be changed with these kinds of external circumstances. So you have a style of reasoning which begins with the observation that there is internal to every one of us this potentiality, I prefer to say authentic possibility, of realizing ourselves, which is not simply realizing our feelings or heart and mind, satisfying heart and mind, but also realizing our body. Inherent in our nature, there's always that possibility. So if we develop this heart to the utmost, we can actually serve heaven and fulfill our destiny. By implication, evil is not inborn, but due to our failure or our inability to avoid external influences and develop certain kind of inertia. So evil can be understood in three senses. The inertia that somehow we become incapacitated in the dynamic unfolding and development of ourselves. Inertia could turn out to be habits. That's the danger of the small body. The notion is one particular desire becomes so powerful, we try to satisfy it. And other desires are being undermined. And other desires being undermined, it's very difficult for us a balanced way. For example, appetite is so powerful that we ignore many other aspects of our desires. And that desire will lead to an expanded version of that desire. There's no limit to that process because it's not a balancing act. Unless you return to the heart and mind, which is more holistic, which has more comprehension of who you are, you will not be able to control that particular, the excessive obsession with one type of desire. So in that case, inertia becomes evil in the sense that we're not able to overcome some of the habitual forms. For example, if someone say, quitting smoking is very easy because I've done it many times, it means that the weakness of the will, the Greek notion, the weakness of the will is so powerful that we're no longer being able to respond. Therefore, serious effort must be made to recover the original nature. The original nature as the great body is more encompassing. Because it's more encompassing, it will be able to have a better appreciation of all the proper status, the proper niches of all our instinctual demands, how they should be satisfied. So the end of learning is none other than the search for the lost how. This becomes a form of embodied knowing. It is not simply a knowing that is cognitive, that is simply cerebral. Embodied knowing can be understood as the knowing that necessarily makes a difference in terms of your lifestyle, in terms of your conduct, in terms of your worldview, in terms of your ethical sense. If it doesn't make any difference, it is not embodied knowing. Just like knowing a friend is not simply an internalization of certain kind of skill. It's self-knowledge, and through dialogical encounter, you know the friend through self-understanding, and with understanding a friend, your self-knowledge becomes deepened. It's the classical notion about true dialogue. Martin Buber has talked about the I-Thou relationship rather than the I-It relationship. The I-Thou relationship is that the dialogue, before you enter into the dialogue, your understanding of the self is fundamentally different from after the true dialogue. In other words, a true dialogue with someone forces you to change your outlook. You become broadened, your vision becomes greatly broadened, or your sense of yourself becomes deepened. And that kind of dialogical relationship, like knowing a person, is precisely the image that I think we should have in knowing a text or knowing ourselves. It's pattern recognition to begin with. It is not digital thinking in a limited sense. So the first sign of wisdom, you can say, is that it is beyond information, beyond knowledge. In the world of virtual reality, we sometimes confuse data with information, information with knowledge, and knowledge with wisdom. In this particular situation, the life world, wisdom is always linked to the life world. It's not simply the life of the mind in a speculative, contemplative sense. It's the life world. The life world is complex. It becomes more and more complex. You know, there are two games. One is the chess. We know that chess. The other one is called Go. This is a Japanese term for an ancient Chinese game called Go. Chess, as you know, when you play, the game becomes more and more simplified. You take many of the players away. And now with the computer simulation, and the artificial intelligence is so great that even the grandmasters will not be able to compete with the computer. The blue chip is very powerful with IBM. But if you look at the game as Go, Go, how many of you have seen a game like Go? How many of you not feel? Okay, with the black stones and the white stones, it's just a board with 180 sort of square. So you put one in with your opponent, the other one will put one in. You eventually see how much territory you'll be able to occupy. There's some simple rules on how to occupy the territory. But for us to remember that game is the more you play, the more complex it becomes. Because you put 2 stones and then 4, then 6, the more and more complex. And now, the most sophisticated computer cannot match with a child who's learned how to play after 2 or 3 days. No way. And some people say maybe we need 1 generation to be able to develop certain kind of computer that would be able to play that Go that effectively. It's a different kind of game. It's life. The game is life. And the life situation is very, very difficult because it becomes more and more elaborate and more complex. So if we move beyond simple knowledge, to send wisdom wisdom is always linked to the embodied knowing. There's no possibility to imagine there's some kind of wisdom which is totally disembodied. This kind of sense of wisdom is helps me to understand that one particular feature of the Confucian moral reasoning is to allow 3 domains, often we think are separate domains of human learning, to interact among themselves. The 3 domains, one is aesthetics, to search for the beauty and with emphasis on human sensuality. If you do not have sensual gratifications, it's very difficult to develop a sense of the beauty. So the senses, it's related to the senses of hearing, of seeing, of touching, of knowing, that aesthetic realm. It's one domain. The second domain is the ethical realm. How do we act in a proper way? In the West, most of the Western styles of moral reasoning would say, how do we do it according to the rules of the game? And the third domain is what we call religion. Now, religion is based upon faith. Some of the ethical principles cannot be applied. We have to move beyond aesthetics to become ethical. We have to transcend ethics to become religious. This is one, of course, there are many debates on this issue. There's one very simplified classical understanding of these 3 domains. But if you follow my reasoning here, that these 3 will have to be integrated as a part of moral reasoning to develop a sense of ethical intelligence. You do not undermine all the feelings, the sensory perceptions. You do not undermine them at all. You do not simply try to develop certain kind of spiritual exercise to get rid of them. You allow them to express themselves properly. This is the reason why in Mencius, the really ultimate justification for human self-development as a moral agent is because inherent in our nature are the 4 beginnings of feeling, willing, sensing, knowing, the sense of commiseration, sense of shock. All these sensory perceptions are absolutely critical. These are the resources for us to try to learn the general rules of the game. And ethics, to fully realize itself, will have to be extended beyond the human realm. Not only to know ourselves, but also to know heaven. And the ethical religious realm of knowing heaven is important for understanding how the human world actually works. Human beings, in this sense, are co-creators of the cosmos. We are responsible for the cosmic process. Yes?
How does that relate to the Confucian quote? How can you know heaven, you don't know yourself?
Yes, I think since our nature is confirmed by heaven, so through our personal self-knowledge, we can know heaven. Heaven is not wholly other Heaven is not an intelligence, it's totally beyond our human comprehension. Heaven confirms what our nature is. It's the Confucian faith in the self-transformation of the person. The self-transformation actually requires that we not only understand ourselves, understand our fellow human beings, but also understand our own, our true nature. And this requires a balanced equilibrium, a particular act. And in Mencius, I use the quote that the great man follows rightness. The great man may break promises, may not see his action through, but he acts according to what is right. So the ability to weigh the situation. Some people say, well, it's a situational ethics. It is just to see what is the most appropriate from your point of view at a certain juncture. This is not true at all, because it has to be intersubjectively confirmed. It is not just simply individualistic quests for truth, but it's also communal. Therefore, that which is most personal is also publicly accountable. There's a difference between personal and private. The truly personal, we feel it strongly, the truly personal is always communicative, and it's never simply private. And we need to go beyond simply being private. And that sense of the proper measure, how you do it according to the proper measure, and you learn it from many sources, from exemplary teachers, those accomplished human beings, but from history, from culture, from your ability to understand the general feelings of others through sympathetic resonances with others. Let me end with an anecdote. We may have a little bit of time for some questions. That Mencius decided to characterize his appreciation of Confucius as the timely sage, which is considered the highest form of wisdom from his point of view. There are three types of sages. One is called the pure sage, the sage who exercises or demonstrates purity. The sage has specific principles to observe. He's not going to be polluted by anything. So the quest for the purity of his heart, his mind, it's a demonstration of the highest principle of personal dignity. It's one type of sage. This is easy for us to understand, the people who rises above the multitude and cultivate their own inner purity. In a way, contrary to this particular type is what Mencius called accommodating sage. A sage who is so moved by a sense of social responsibility that wants to help the world to transform itself, to improve the world from within. And this type of sage necessarily involves in the world, in the government, and would like to accommodate themselves to the rules and games of the political arena in order to be effective. So they are not particularly concerned about their personal dignity or inner purity. They're simply concerned about service. They just want to serve the world the best way they see fit. And the third type is called harmonious sage, the sage who want to harmonize himself with the world. Whether there's time to serve, whether there's time to withdraw, just to become totally an integral part of the world. So all these three types could be considered sources of inspiration as the highest manifestation of humanity. Now, Mencius considered Confucius could be understood as a pure sage or accommodating sage or harmonious sage. But he decided to characterize Confucius as a timely sage. Now the question for us is, what is the difference between a timely sage, the sage in terms of it's most appropriate to his time, with a harmonious sage or accommodating sage or a pure sage? And in order to characterize Confucius as a timely sage, Mencius also used the audio with the audio perception, listening, like music, like a symphonic music. The music, of course, is a temporal art. Depends very much upon the appropriate moment, appropriate time. Now, the timely sage then is not simply a harmonious, accommodating, a pure sage, but reaches a higher level of synthesis of the three types. And unless we can understand a pure sage as a sign of wisdom, no question about it, because internal spiritual exercises. Accommodating sage is also a sign of wisdom with a particular sense of service. Harmonious sage is also a sign of wisdom, able to harmonize various kinds of situations. Now, these different styles of learning to be human, all linked to the belief, the basic belief in the perfectibility of human nature through self-effort, through effort of the particular person. But it is an answer to the dehumanizing tendencies of the historical moment, or our moment, any moment. And all of us is inalienably circumscribed in that particular moment. In other words, the moment is that there are so many dehumanizing forces that were not able to help us to flourish. Now, Mencius would say if the time is very hard, that people become aggressive. If time is very good, that people become self-indulgent. So the time from the outside always presents some kind of dehumanizing challenge. How to direct the energies to face up to the dehumanizing forces without leaving the world. You're still in the world. You're not leaving the world. You do not create any kind of spiritual sanctuary outside of this world here and now and try to do it. And then the wisdom in this particular sense is a kind of practical wisdom. It is not a wisdom of the high intelligence that will be able to see things totally above or outside of the world here and now. It is practical living. Wisdom is practical living. And the idea of practical living is that since the belief that the ultimate value of human existence is near at hand, and the desire for humanity entails the strength for its realization. The ultimate meaning of life is not afterlife. It's not a spiritual realm outside of the world here and now. It is realizable and ought to be realized in our ordinary human existence, in the life world here and now. Maybe one or two questions, if you have. Yes? Yeah, the question is, I don't know, maybe some of you, what is the Confucian notion of heaven? Certainly it's not the holy other, as the idea of the Christian God. It's not the Greek notion of logos. It's not like the Indian notion or the Hindu notion of Brahman as the cosmic soul, as opposed to. So what is your sense? Preliminary sense. So what is the Confucian idea of heaven? Heaven, first of all, is a source. Heaven is a source of life. Heaven is a vital we can say, cosmic creativity. The four seasons, you can say nature, all the forces that will be able to engender the creative transformation of the world. So heaven, in that sense, is the source of all vitality, all life forces. But heaven is also the ultimate source of meaning, the meaning of life, the meaning of human existence. You eventually refer to heaven, but heaven is internal. It's not totally external, and we can know heaven. But because the veil of ignorance we can never fully know ourselves or fully realize ourselves, even though we are in the process of trying to do so. And in that sense, we are also not capable of fully comprehending the decree of heaven. That's why sometimes we serve heaven with a sense of reverence or respect towards heaven. Yes?
What about hell?
Hell.
Yes.
There's no hell. The idea of the hell came much later in China because of the influence of Buddhism. But there, in the classical period, that's true with maybe Greek thought and many other traditions. There's no conception of hell as the result of the positive evil. So there's no conception of hell. And after we fade away, our soul dissipates into the cosmic order. But we can become immortal through word, through other kind of agencies. But there is a great deal of discussion of the idea of the afterlife, but there's no conception of soul, of hell.